And now we turn to our politics panel. Ruth Marcus is a columnist and deputy editorial page editor at the Washington Post. Ben Domenech is the publisher of the Federalist. John Heilemann is from Bloomberg Politics, and Ed O'Keefe covers politics for the Washington Post. Ed, I cut you off last time you were on the broadcast, so I'm starting with you. New president in 5 days. Give us your lay of the landscape.
Well, you know, I think it's important, despite what the vice president-elect said about 30 out of 50 states in a landslide, to remember, if you look at polling that was out this week, only 37% of Americans have a favorable opinion of the president-elect. That is a, at least modern history, historic low. Usually you see a bounce for someone who wins, and he didn't really ever see one. The other thing I think that's important in those numbers, 34% believe he'd be a better leader than President Obama, also a pretty poor showing on that regard. And the one that I keep coming back to, 2-1, Americans believe he needs to stop tweeting. And I think given what we've seen this weekend, one wonders if we'll see that. There's certainly suggestions today from the vice president-elect that that won't happen. But I think that really eats at the craw of a lot of people who are concerned about him becoming president, that he's not necessarily trying to be the leader of all. He's trying to perhaps just be the leader of those 30 or 50 states.
Right. Ben, what do you make of those numbers for Donald Trump as he comes in?
I think it really says how much more important this inaugural address is going to be compared to perhaps other ones. The tone that Trump takes, the tone that he really has when he comes and speaks in front of the American people is going to send a message one way or the other. Is it a unifying tone? Is it sounding a note of optimism about an ability to work across partisan lines to be a non-traditional president in a way that benefits the American people? Or does he give them an address that is more, I come not to bring peace but the sword, a message of really anti-Washington, anti-elite sentiment that says to the American people, the people who voted for him, that he is going to be their champion and return power back to them away from the Washington elite that they so despise. I think that decision is really going to have a lot of impact in the early days of his presidency, particularly given that he's going to be announcing one of his most controversial decisions, or what is likely to be, in the first couple of weeks, and that is his Supreme Court nomination, which is likely to put everyone back in their normal trenches when it comes to Democrats and Republicans.
I think Ben is right. A healing and welcoming tone in the inaugural address is necessary, but it's not sufficient. On election night, Donald Trump said the right thing. He said he wanted to bind the wounds of division. Almost everything that he's done since then has been not binding wounds, but exposing them. And it's not necessarily that he continues to tweet, because I think we know he's going to do that. It's what he tweets. And it's not necessarily what he'll say in the inaugural address, because I assume he will rise to the occasion. I certainly hope so. But it's how he behaves afterwards. And he needs to start behaving like the healer-in-chief.
John, your view?
Even after the contentiousness of the 2000 election, where many people thought that George W. Bush was given the presidency by the Supreme Court, Bush entered office with a 61% approval rating, even with all of that division then. So the approval rating matters a lot. If he's going to be a successful president, he needs to reach out and build a broader base. He did not win the popular vote. He won very narrowly in the Electoral College. I think he's 100% legitimate as a president, but that is a political challenge he faces. He also faces another set of challenges, which is that normally the reason you get a honeymoon as president-elect and then as president is that you start with a clean slate. On the questions of Russia and this election, and now these questions that David was just talking about on the show, and on the questions of his business conflicts, these are large-scale potential scandals or controversies that he brings with him into the office. There are ethics specialists of Democrat and Republican stripe alike who say that he's going to be sued the moment that he takes the oath of office on the basis of the fact that he is violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution because he hasn't untangled his business empire. Those are, whatever you think of them on the merits, huge political challenges for a new president to come in with that much baggage attached to their wagon.
And there's other baggage, John, that isn't necessarily his doing, but we were reminded of it this week, which is the feeling that many people have out there that FBI Director James Comey unfairly and inappropriately and effectively, even whatever his intention was, intervened in the election. Now we know we're going to have two continuing investigations, right, plus the potential ethics issues. The essential look into Russia, and the Inspector General, who is going to be looking behind the scenes. It will take months, possibly a year, to look into Comey's behavior. And what that means is we have this very fragile and volatile state in our democracy. A lot of people who may not question Trump's legitimacy, but question what has gone on here, and we're going to keep going.
Let me ask you this, though, Ben. While that's all going on, there's going to be a lot of, Sturm und Drang. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are going to be passing legislation. I mean, that's what I wonder is whether some of this is. Well, just give me your sense of that. I mean, there's another actor in the party here, too.
You know, the thing that's interesting about the mood on Capitol Hill among Republicans right now is that there are a couple different classes. There are people who are very optimistic right now that they're going to be able to pass through legislation that they've been trying to advance for the past 6, 8, 10 years and without success, that they're going to pass that through Congress and that Donald Trump is going to rubber stamp it and not really play a significant role in changing it. That's the mood, certainly among a lot of Republican leaders. At the same time, there's a camp of people who I would put in the sort of skeptical camp among the Republicans who feel like they're going to be able to work with Donald Trump on a handful of issues, but then also have to balance against him on other counts. And I think a good example of that is someone like Rand Paul, who has been out there vocally supporting Donald Trump's commitment to pass a replacement for Obamacare very soon after repeal. But that's the kind of aggressive step that Paul and Trump can agree on. But he is also preparing, along with a lot of the other libertarian leading members of the Congress, to balance against Donald Trump when it comes to all sorts of issues related to civil liberties, where they feel like this administration is not going to be as aligned.
And Ed McConnell's going to need 60 votes in the Senate. And if we have this kind of conflict that we've been talking about, Democrats are going to pay a price for working with Donald Trump.
They're going to pay a price for working with him. Republicans may pay a price for not getting any Democrats to play along with them. I would, it's been 2 weeks of the new Congress, and say that, on the Senate side, there are some genuine attempts at cooperation underway. I think you saw Joe Manchin earlier talking about the eagerness to do it. He needs to do it, frankly, if he expects to be reelected. Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Donnelly, Claire McCaskill, among others, have to think about it as Democrats. But, I would caution things up there are pretty hot right now. I think the comments made by John Lewis this weekend had as much to do with the presidency as it does with the tinderbox nature of the House right now. If you look at what's gone on up there, kind of under the radar with all the focus on the administration in waiting, you've had attempts to undo an ethics office. You've had stiff penalties put in place on members who may try to act out on the House floor. They're seen as sort of retribution against Democrats. Amid that, you had a Republican congressman suggest that Mexican performers who were campaigning in Nevada with Democrats were just as much trying to influence the election on behalf of Mexico as the hackers did for Russia. And then you have this fight over art hanging on the walls of the Capitol and whether or not some of it was appropriate. All these little things add up. And at some point, if there is no check on this, or if there's no attempt at cooperation, I think you could see some real trouble for Republican stewardship of Congress.
John, what do you make of the drive the bus question I was trying to get at, which is Donald Trump has a set of views on Russia, on torture, that seem at odds with the people who are going to head his cabinet?
Well, I agree with David on all issues, right? That that not just on some specific things. I mean across the board in the sense that Donald Trump is driving the bus. Donald Trump is going to drive the bus. He drove the bus on his campaign. He is a bus driver at heart, right? But the reality is that some rules of physics are not repealed by Donald Trump being president. And those rules go back years in this city in politics, which is that if you have a Secretary of Defense and a National Security Advisor who are at war, it is a problem for your foreign policy. If you have big divisions between the agencies, broadly speaking, and the White House staff, it is a problem. And so, especially, it's always a problem, but it's a particularly potentially large problem for a president of the United States who has never has no government experience whatsoever, and is dealing with, not in the agencies, but in the White House, the least experienced staff in this city of any presidency that we've ever seen.
But I think the real issue here is that with all of these different types of folks in this cabinet, representing different viewpoints and having a lot of different backgrounds, we're not going to really know who Donald Trump is listening to on each of these subjects until a moment of crisis. We learned in the early days of the Bush administration, after the interaction with the Chinese spy plane incident, we learned that George W. Bush was listening more to the Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice school than we might have expected, given some of his other choices going in. We're going to find out which of these folks he's named he actually listens to once there's a moment of crisis.
Or speaks to, because that was some some of the astonishing testimony that we had this week about conversations that weren't had with the president-elect and his Secretary of State nominee about Russia, or with the nominee to head Homeland Security about immigration policy. He is the bus driver. Has he spoken to his passengers? Has he spoken to, or the members of his fleet? And Newt Gingrich used the word entrepreneurial about his leadership style. Another word for that might be less polite might be incoherent.
Or improvisational.
Or both.
Right. Let me dismount from the bus metaphors for a moment. Go ahead.
I wanted to continue it just one more moment, because we just want to caution that whether he's talked to the passengers is one thing. Who's going to actually be on the bus remains an open question. Right. We have seen Republicans doubt whether Tillerson can do the job, and if they hold out this week on him or in the coming weeks, he may not board that bus. It's just worth pointing out that there are Republicans that are still concerned about him getting the job.
Right. Ben, give me your sense of Obamacare. Donald Trump really raised the bar this week in his press conference. He said not only will it be repealed and replaced, he said simultaneously, that was his word, but it will be much better and cost less. Really? That's a big...
He has promised an enormous number of things to the American people, and he's not going to stop, apparently, now that he's actually in charge. This is one of those moments where you do have a situation where legislative realities come smack into an agenda that has been very ambitious really from day one. But I think that what is clear about this Obamacare incident is that Donald Trump is going to be demanding certain things of Republicans in Congress. He wants them to deliver on these promises, and they are going to have to work to find ways to both keep his sort of statements realistic and given what they can do with the level of representation that they have, but also that recognizes the process that has to play out just according to the way that our government works. That this legislation has to be formed and moved through.
Given the confusion about what Republicans want as a replacement for Obamacare. If you are going to do a substantially different health care reform law, it cannot be done immediately. It's not possible. Well, if repeal and replace happen close to simultaneously, what it will be replaced with is something that is 85% Obamacare, rebranded with a few small changes, because there's not a full-blown thing that exists.
I think there are a few important things for the president-elect to keep in mind. He should think about a previous president, the incumbent president's grandiose promises about if you like your health care, you can keep it. We're going to cover everybody. Nobody's going to be worse off. Those are dangerous promises to make. Also announcing that you're going to have an immediate replacement when you have a 60-vote threshold in the Senate. That's also going to be very hard.
And doing health care reform only with Republican votes. The biggest mistake Barack Obama made was doing health care reform with only Democratic votes. If Donald Trump does it with only Republican votes, it will be the same mistake.
And that won't be physically possible.
All right. Unfortunately, physically possible is also us. We have limitations ourselves. And we'll be back in a moment.